The smell hit me first. Not the familiar, honest stench of decay I'd grown accustomed to in my 30 years as Limgrave's gravedigger, but something else entirely. Something wrong. The corpse of Merchant Aldwin lay before me on the wooden table in my stone cellar, and despite having been dead for 3 days, his flesh remained as pink and supple as the day he'd drawn his last breath. No bloating, no discoloration, no flies. I pressed my calloused fingers against his wrist, half expecting warmth, but found only the cold stillness of death. Yet something beneath his skin seemed to pulse, not a heartbeat, but something deeper, more fundamental, like the earth itself was breathing through his bones. "Matthias," came a whisper, so faint I thought it was the wind through the cellar's cracked stones. I froze. The voice had come from the corpse. My hands trembled as I stepped back from the table, knocking over my bucket of blessed oils. The liquid spread across the stone floor in dark rivulets, reflecting the candlelight like tiny golden stars. In my 3 decades of preparing the dead for their final rest, I'd seen plenty of strange things. Bodies that seemed to shift in the corner of my eye, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, the occasional twitch of muscle that meant nothing more than trapped air escaping. But never this. "Matthias," the voice came again, clearer now. Aldwin's lips hadn't moved. His eyes remained closed, sunken slightly into their sockets as they should be. But the voice was definitely his. That same reedy tone he'd used when haggling over prices for his travelling wares, the same accent from the northern reaches of Limgrave where he'd been born. I'd known Aldwin since I was a boy. He'd been one of the few merchants brave enough to travel the dangerous roads between settlements, always carrying news from distant lands along with his goods. Last week, he'd told me about strange lights seen dancing above the Erd tree at night, how the very air seemed to shimmer with an energy that made his horses nervous. 3 days ago, his cart had been found overturned on the road to Mistwood, his body lying peacefully beside it, with no visible wounds, no signs of struggle. Natural causes, the village elder had declared. Heart failure, most likely. I'd prepared hundreds of bodies for burial. My father had taught me the rituals, just as his father had taught him. Wash the body with blessed water, anoint with sacred oils, wrap in white linen blessed by the traveling priests, dig the grave 6 feet deep, oriented toward the rising sun, cover with blessed earth and mark with a simple stone. Allow the soul to find its rest in the golden embrace of the Erd tree's grace. But something was different about death in Limgrave lately. Over the past few months, I'd noticed subtle changes that I'd tried to dismiss. Bodies that took longer to stiffen. Graves that seemed to exhale a faint golden mist at dawn. Dreams where the dead called my name from beneath the earth, begging to be freed from something I couldn't understand. "Help me," Aldwin whispered. And this time I saw his chest rise slightly with the words. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible. Dead men don't speak. Dead men don't breathe. Dead men certainly don't call out to gravediggers in candlelit cellars. But I'd seen too much strangeness lately to dismiss this as imagination or exhaustion. I forced myself to step closer to the table, studying Aldwin's face in the flickering light. His features were peaceful, almost serene, but there was something wrong with the shadows. They seemed too deep around his eyes, too dark beneath his chin, as if they were being drawn into his skin rather than cast by the candlelight. "What do you need?" I whispered, feeling foolish for speaking to a corpse, but unable to stop myself. The temperature in the cellar dropped suddenly, my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The candles flickered but didn't go out, their flames bending toward Aldwin's body as if drawn by some invisible force. "The sleep won't come." His voice was growing fainter, more distant. "Something holds us here, something golden. Golden." The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold air. Everything in the lands between was touched by gold these days, the light of the Erd tree that blessed our crops, the sacred oils used in burial rites, even the coins we used for trade bore the symbol of the great tree. Gold was supposed to represent grace, divine blessing, the natural order of life and death. But what if it wasn't a blessing at all? I'd heard whispers from travelers about changes in distant lands, stories of warriors who couldn't die, of nobles who lived far beyond their natural years, of ancient magics that bound souls to flesh long after the spirit should have departed. The village elder dismissed such tales as superstition, but standing here in my cellar with a talking corpse, I began to wonder if those stories might hold more truth than anyone wanted to admit. "Tell me what you see," I said, leaning closer despite every instinct screaming at me to run. Aldwin's eyes snapped open. They glowed with a soft golden light, like candle flames trapped beneath glass. His pupils were gone, replaced by tiny points of radiance that seemed to contain vast depths. When he looked at me, I felt as though he was seeing not just my face, but every grave I'd ever dug, every body I'd ever prepared, every prayer I'd ever spoken over the dead. "I see the truth," he said, and his voice no longer sounded like the merchant I'd known. It carried harmonics now, echoes of something vast and incomprehensible. "Death is broken, Matthias. The cycle has been shattered, and we are trapped between what was and what should be. The golden light that promises rest brings only chains." The cellar began to fill with that same golden radiance, seeping through the cracks in the stone walls, pooling on the floor like liquid starlight. It was beautiful and terrible, warm and cold, familiar and completely alien. I realized I was looking at the same light that crowned the Erd tree, the same grace that supposedly blessed our land and guided our souls to eternal rest. But there was nothing restful about it. It pulsed with hungry energy, reaching toward me with tendrils that felt more like grasping fingers than divine illumination. "Run," Aldwin whispered, his voice returning to normal for just a moment. "Run and never stop running. The dead are waking and they remember everything." The golden light suddenly intensified, flooding the cellar with radiance so bright I had to shield my eyes. When it faded, Aldwin's eyes had closed again, and his body lay still and silent on the table. But the smell of wrongness remained stronger now, mixed with something that reminded me of heated metal and burning incense. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Everything I thought I knew about death, about my purpose in this world, about the very nature of existence in the lands between, crumbled like ancient parchment in my hands. Above me, through the cellar's small window, I could see the distant glow of the Erd tree on the horizon. Its golden light had always been a comfort, a sign of divine order and natural harmony. But now it looked different, not like a beacon of hope, but like a massive eye watching everything beneath its gaze, holding it all in place with chains of light. I had a choice to make. I could pretend this had never happened, bury Aldwin as planned, and continue my life as Limgrave's gravedigger. Or I could accept that something fundamental had changed in the lands between, something that made death itself a lie. The decision was made for me when I heard them, voices calling from beneath the earth outside, dozens of them, hundreds. All the people I'd buried over the years, all calling my name in unison, begging to be freed from their golden prison. The brutal reality of death in Elden Ring was about to reveal itself, and I was the only one who could hear its terrible truth. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, with the voices of the dead echoing through the floorboards of my cottage? They whispered my name in a chorus that rose and fell like wind through wheat fields, sometimes pleading, sometimes accusing, always desperate. By dawn, the voices had faded to silence, but their words remained burned into my memory like brands on flesh. Standing at my window, I watched the sun rise over the cemetery I'd tended for 3 decades. The morning light should have brought comfort, but instead it revealed details I'd never noticed before. Each gravestone cast shadows that seemed too long, too dark, reaching toward each other like grasping fingers. The grass grew in strange patterns, forming spirals and symbols that hurt to look at directly. And there, scattered across the ground like fallen stars, were tiny points of golden light that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. I dressed quickly and stepped outside, my bare feet immediately sensing the wrongness in the earth. The soil felt alive beneath me, warm and trembling, as if something vast was breathing just below the surface. The golden points of light were everywhere, now that I knew to look for them. Embedded in tree bark, floating in puddles of rainwater, dancing around the edges of my vision like fireflies made of pure radiance. My first stop was old Martha's grave. She'd been the village herbalist before her death 2 winters ago, and I'd prepared her body with particular care, knowing how much she'd meant to the community. Her headstone stood exactly where I'd placed it, But the earth around her grave had shifted, not sunken as graves naturally do when the soil settles, but raised slightly as if something beneath was pushing upward. I knelt and pressed my palm against the disturbed earth. Immediately, I felt it. A presence, aware and waiting. Martha's voice rose from the soil, muffled but unmistakable. "Matthias, child, you must listen. The golden grace that lights our world. It's not what they told us. It doesn't guide souls to rest. It binds them here, holds them in place. We're trapped between life and death, unable to move forward, unable to return." My hand jerked back as if burned. The implications of her words crashed over me like a tide. If Martha was right, if the dead truly couldn't find peace, then every burial I'd performed, every prayer I'd spoken, every ritual I'd completed with such careful devotion had been meaningless. Worse than meaningless, I'd been helping to trap souls in an endless limbo. I moved through the cemetery in a daze, checking grave after grave. Each one showed the same signs: earth that pulsed with hidden life, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and that persistent golden light that seemed to seep from the very stones. At each grave, I heard whispers, fragments of conversations, pleas for help, warnings about the true nature of grace in the lands between. By midday, I could no longer deny what was happening. The dead were indeed trapped, held in place by the same golden light that was supposed to represent divine blessing. But how was this possible? The priests who visited our village spoke of the greater will, of the Erd Tree's grace guiding all souls to eternal rest. They blessed our burial oils, sanctified our rituals, assured us that death was merely a doorway to a greater existence. Had they lied, or were they simply ignorant of the truth? I was contemplating this terrible possibility when I saw it, a sight that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. There, in the center of the cemetery where no grave had ever been dug, a pillar of golden light erupted from the earth. It rose 20 feet into the air, pulsing with energy that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. At its base, the grass had withered away, leaving behind soil that glowed with the same radiance. This wasn't natural light. It wasn't even magical light, at least not in any way I understood magic. This was something fundamental, something woven into the very fabric of reality, in the lands between. And as I stared at it, I began to understand things that no simple gravedigger should ever comprehend. The light wasn't just illumination, it was information, knowledge, memory. Every soul that had ever lived and died in this region, their experiences and essence trapped within that golden radiance, like insects in amber. I could feel them all: farmers and merchants, soldiers and scholars, children who'd died too young, and elders who'd lived too long. All of them held in stasis, unable to move on to whatever came after death. But there was something else within the light, something that made my soul recoil in horror. Their presence vast and alien, completely indifferent to human suffering. It wasn't malevolent exactly. It simply didn't care whether the souls it collected were in agony or bliss. They were resources to be gathered, power to be hoarded, pieces in a game so incomprehensibly large that individual lives meant nothing at all. The greater will. I knew its name without being told, the knowledge flowing into my mind like water into a cup. This was the cosmic force that shaped reality in the lands between, the entity that had shattered something called the Elden Ring and plunged the world into its current state of broken order. Death was supposed to be a release, a return to the cosmic whole. Instead, it had become a form of imprisonment. As this understanding crystallized in my mind, the pillar of light began to pulse more rapidly. I felt a tugging sensation, as if invisible hands were trying to drag me toward the radiance. The golden points of light scattered throughout the cemetery started moving, flowing like liquid toward the central pillar, and I realized with growing horror that they were pieces of souls, fragments of everyone who had ever died here, including fragments of me. I looked down at my hands and saw tiny motes of golden light drifting from my skin like luminous dust. Not much, but enough to confirm what I was beginning to suspect. The boundary between life and death in the lands between wasn't as clear as I'd always believed. Living people were already partially claimed by whatever force controlled death, already being slowly absorbed into that vast golden prison. The tugging sensation grew stronger, and I found myself taking involuntary steps toward the pillar of light. Each step felt like walking through thick honey, the air itself resisting my movement while simultaneously pulling me forward. The whispers of the dead grew louder, more urgent, but I couldn't tell if they were warning me away or begging me to join them. Then, just as the golden radiance reached out to embrace me, something else intervened. A different kind of light appeared, not golden, but silver-white, clean and sharp as starlight. It formed a protective barrier around me, cutting through the pulling force of the greater radiance like a blade through silk. The silver light felt familiar somehow, though I was certain I'd never encountered anything like it before. Within that protective glow, I heard a new voice, not one of the trapped dead, but something else entirely, ancient beyond measure, yet somehow more human than the cosmic indifference of the greater will. "Matthias of Limgrave," the voice said, and each word rang like a bell in my bones. "You have been chosen to see the truth that others cannot bear. The cycle of death has been broken, but it can be mended. Will you accept the burden of this knowledge?" I wanted to refuse. Every instinct told me to run back to my cottage, to resume my simple life of digging graves and preparing bodies, to pretend I'd never seen what I'd seen, or learned what I'd learned. But the voices of the trapped dead still echoed in my memory, and I thought of all the souls I'd unknowingly helped to imprison over the years. "What do I have to do?" I whispered. The silver light pulsed once, twice, then began to fade, but before it disappeared entirely, it left something behind. A small glowing fragment that settled into my palm like a fallen star. The moment it touched my skin, new knowledge flooded my mind. Visions of ancient rituals, forgotten prayers, ways to help the trapped souls find true rest. But the knowledge came with a price. I could see the threads of golden light that connected every living thing in the lands between to that vast, hungry presence. I could perceive the slow dissolution of boundaries between life and death, the gradual absorption of all existence into a single, undifferentiated mass of golden radiance. And I could see that I was now marked by both forces, the silver light of true death and the golden light of eternal imprisonment. The two energies warred within me, each trying to claim dominance, and I knew that this internal conflict would define the rest of my existence. The pillar of golden light began to fade, sinking back into the earth as if it had never been. The cemetery returned to its normal appearance, though I could still see the underlying wrongness that permeated everything. The dead fell silent, but I knew they were still there, still trapped, still waiting for someone to free them from their golden chains. I closed my fist around the silver fragment, feeling its cool energy merge with my flesh and bone. Whatever I had become in that moment, prophet, heretic, or simply a man who had seen too much, there was no going back. The brutal reality of death in Elden Ring had revealed itself to me, and now I carried the responsibility of that knowledge. The question was, what would I do with it? The silver fragment in my palm had grown warm, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, as I prepared for a journey I never imagined I'd have to make. 3 days had passed since my encounter with the pillar of golden light, and in that time the whispers of the dead had grown more urgent, more desperate. They were calling me towards something, or someone, that might hold the key to understanding how death had been broken in the lands between. My preparations were simple. I filled a worn leather satchel with basic supplies, dried meat, hard bread, a water skin, and the blessed oils I used in my burial rites. The oils felt different now, heavier somehow, as if they too had been tainted by the golden corruption that permeated everything. I strapped my father's old shovel to my back, not for digging graves this time, but because something deep in my bones told me I might need to dig up more than just earth before this journey ended. The dead had been specific in their whispered directions. Follow the old pilgrim's road toward the Mistwood, then turn north at the Bridge of Sorrows, where the ancient cemetery of Summonwater Village lay half submerged in perpetual fog. There, they promised, I would find answers about the true nature of death in our cursed realm. As I left my cottage at dawn, I looked back one last time at the cemetery that had been my life's work. In the growing light, I could see things that would have been invisible to me just days ago. Golden threads connecting each grave to something vast and hungry in the distance, the slow writhing of the earth as trapped souls struggled against their bonds, And most disturbing of all, the way the very air seemed to shimmer with harvested essence, the spiritual remains of every person who had ever died here. The pilgrim's road had once been well maintained, used by travelers seeking to pay their respects at the great Erd tree. Now it was cracked and overgrown, with weeds pushing through the ancient stones like grasping fingers. As I walked, I began to notice things that chilled me to the bone. Abandoned campsites where travelers had simply stopped moving forward, their belongings scattered around what looked like human-shaped impressions in the earth. No bodies, no bones, just the suggestion that people had been absorbed directly into the ground itself. The silver fragment in my palm grew warmer as I approached each of these sites, and when I pressed it against the earth, I could hear echoes of final moments, screams cut short, prayers that went unanswered, the terrible realization that the golden light they had sought as salvation was actually their doom. These weren't ordinary deaths from bandits or wild beasts. These people had been consumed by the very grace they had come to worship. By midday I reached the Bridge of Sorrows and immediately understood how it had earned its name. The stone structure spanned a narrow river that ran red with something that wasn't quite blood, but wasn't quite water either. The liquid gave off a faint golden luminescence, and when droplets splashed onto the bridge's railings, they left behind crystalline deposits that hummed with trapped energy. More disturbing were the figures standing motionless along the bridge's length. At first glance, they appeared to be statues, perfectly preserved warriors, merchants, and pilgrims frozen in various poses. But as I drew closer, I realized they were people, or what had once been people, their flesh transformed into something resembling polished stone, shot through with veins of gold. Their eyes tracked my movement, following me with expressions of infinite sadness and desperate hunger. One of them, a woman in what had once been traveling robes, opened her mouth as I passed. No sound emerged, but I could see golden light pouring out like liquid fire, and within that light, the shape of words. Help us. The same plea I'd been hearing from the dead in my cemetery, but now I understood it came from something far worse than simple death. These people were trapped in their own bodies, transformed into living monuments to the greater will's power, conscious but unable to move, unable to die, unable to do anything but watch as more victims crossed the bridge. I quickened my pace, the silver fragment now burning against my palm like a coal from hell's own fire. Whatever force had given it to me was reacting to the concentrated corruption of this place, and I could feel knowledge flowing into my mind, terrible understanding about what had happened to these people, and what would happen to me if I lingered too long. The transformation was gradual. First, the golden grace would begin to accumulate in a person's flesh, drawn by their natural connection to the Erd tree's light. Then it would start to crystallize, turning blood to liquid gold, bone to aureate stone, thought to trapped light. The victim would remain conscious throughout the entire process, feeling their humanity drain away drop by drop while their body became a conduit for the greater will's incomprehensible purposes. I ran. Behind me, I heard the grinding sound of stone moving against stone as the transformed figures turned to watch my retreat. Their golden eyes followed me long after I'd crossed the bridge and turned north towards Summonwater village, and I knew that part of me, some essential spark of my being, had been marked by their attention. The fog began almost immediately after I left the road. It rose from the marshy ground like the breath of sleeping giants, thick and luminescent, carrying scents that reminded me of incense and decay in equal measure. The silver fragment guided me through the mist, growing warm when I moved in the right direction, cool when I strayed from the path. But even with its guidance, I could sense things moving in the fog around me, shapes that weren't quite human, sounds that weren't quite voices, presences that watched from just beyond the edge of vision. Summonwater village, when I finally found it, was far worse than anything the whispers of the dead had prepared me for. The entire settlement lay half submerged in a lake of that same red-gold liquid I'd seen at the bridge, but here it was deeper, more concentrated, almost solid in its luminescent density. Buildings protruded from the surface like the ribs of some massive beast, their windows glowing with trapped souls that pressed against the glass, like insects trying to escape amber. The cemetery occupied a small hill at the village's center, the only part of the settlement that remained above the supernatural flood. But the graves here were nothing like those in my own cemetery. These were elaborate affairs, crypts and mausoleums carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, headstones that seemed to be made of crystallized screams, and monuments that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. And everywhere, the dead walked. Not as shambling corpses or ethereal spirits, but as perfectly preserved people going through the motions of life with mechanical precision. They tended graves that didn't need tending, performed burial rites over empty holes, and spoke to each other in voices that carried no emotion, no humanity, just the hollow echo of remembered conversation. At the cemetery's heart stood a crypt larger than the rest, its doors standing open to reveal depths that seemed to descend far beyond what the hill's size could contain. Golden light poured from those depths, like water from a spring, and I could hear something singing in harmonies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The song was beautiful and terrible, promising rest and threatening imprisonment in the same melodic phrase. The silver fragment in my palm had grown so hot it was nearly unbearable, but it also provided the only protection I had against the overwhelming presence that emanated from the crypt. I could feel the attention of something vast turning toward me, ancient beyond measure and utterly alien in its priorities. This was one of the nodes through which the greater will exercised its control over death in the lands between, and it had noticed my arrival. The walking dead turned toward me in perfect unison, their movements synchronized like dancers in some cosmic ballet. They didn't approach, but their collective gaze felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Among them, I recognized faces from my own village, people who had died years ago whose bodies I had prepared with my own hands. They looked exactly as they had in life, but their eyes held that same golden radiance I'd seen in Aldwin's corpse. "Matthias," they spoke in unison, their voices blending into a harmony that resonated in my bones. "You have come seeking truth about death. We can show you truth. We can show you the peace that comes with surrender to the greater will's design." I wanted to run again, to flee back to my simple cottage and pretend none of this had happened. But the silver fragment pulsed with warmth, reminding me of the choice I'd made and the responsibility I'd accepted. The dead in my cemetery were counting on me. The transformed figures on the bridge were counting on me. Everyone who had ever lived and died in the lands between was counting on someone to break the cycle that held them in eternal torment. "Show me," I whispered, and stepped toward the open crypt. The walking dead parted before me like water, their golden eyes never leaving my face as I approached the source of that terrible singing. With each step, I could feel more of myself being drawn into the cosmic web that connected all death in the lands between. The silver fragment fought against the pull, but I could sense it was a temporary protection at best. At the threshold of the crypt, I paused and looked back at the submerged village, at the transformed people going through their eternal motions, at the fog that concealed horrors I could only imagine. This was what death looked like in the lands between. Not an ending, but a transformation into something that served purposes beyond human understanding. And I was about to descend into the heart of that system, carrying only a fragment of silver light and the desperate hope that somewhere in the depths below, I might find a way to set things right. The singing grew louder as I stepped into the crypt, and I realized that the voices belonged to everyone who had ever died here. A choir of the damned, harmonizing their eternal suffering into something that sounded almost like joy. The brutal reality of death in Elden Ring was about to reveal its deepest secrets, and I was no longer certain I would survive the revelation. The descent into the crypt was like falling through liquid starlight. Each step down the spiral staircase carried me deeper into a space that defied the physical laws I thought I understood. The walls pulsed with veins of golden light that branched and converged like a vast circulatory system, and with each pulse, I could hear the collective heartbeat of every soul trapped within the greater will's design. The singing grew more complex as I descended, individual voices beginning to separate from the harmonious whole. I heard my mother's voice, dead these 15 years, weaving through melodies sung by childhood friends, village elders, even the family dog that had died when I was 7. They were all here, all part of this eternal choir, all singing the same song of beautiful imprisonment. But it was what I saw carved into the walls that truly broke my understanding of death in the lands between. The carvings weren't made by human hands. They flowed and shifted like living things, telling stories in a language that bypassed my eyes and spoke directly to my soul. I watched the history of the lands between unfold in moving pictures that made my mind reel with their implications. Once, death had been simple, a natural transition from one state of being to another, governed by ancient forces that cared nothing for individual consciousness, but respected the cosmic balance between existence and void. Souls would live, die, and return to the primordial source to be recycled into new forms of life. It was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was. But then came the greater will. I saw it arrive like a golden meteor, piercing the veil between dimensions and embedding itself in the reality of the lands between. It brought with it concepts that had never existed here before: eternal order, divine hierarchy, the idea that consciousness was too precious to be allowed to simply end. The greater will didn't destroy the natural cycle of death. It perverted it, turning what should have been a release into a form of cosmic digestion. The Elden Ring itself was revealed to me as a massive mechanism for processing souls, breaking them down into component parts that could be reorganized according to the greater will's incomprehensible design. Death became not an ending but a transformation, with the resulting energy used to power the golden order that now governed reality throughout the realm. But the most horrifying revelation was yet to come. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a vast chamber that seemed to extend in all directions beyond the reach of sight. The floor was made of something that looked like crystallized souls, transparent and luminous, with faces and forms visible just beneath the surface like insects trapped in amber. Thousands of them. Millions. Everyone who had ever died in the lands between since the greater will's arrival, all compressed into a single surface that I was now walking upon. At the center of the chamber stood a figure that I initially mistook for a statue. It was massive, easily 20 feet tall, carved from what appeared to be black stone shot through with veins of silver. But as I approached, I realized it wasn't carved at all. It was grown, like some terrible crystal formation that had taken humanoid shape. The figure's face was turned upward, as if watching something in the darkness above, and its features were hauntingly beautiful in their alien perfection. This was one of the two fingers, I realized. Not a god, exactly, but something close enough to divinity to serve as an intermediary between the cosmic forces and the mortal realm. And it was dying. The silver veins that ran through its form were spreading, consuming the black stone with crystalline growths that sang in harmonies I could feel in my bones. This was the same silver light that had protected me in the cemetery, the same energy that powered the fragment in my palm. But seeing it in its raw form, watching it slowly consume one of the greater will's own servants, I began to understand what I was really witnessing. This was the infection of true death, fighting back against the golden corruption that had perverted the natural order. The two fingers was being slowly transformed, not into another servant of the greater will, but into something that remembered what death was supposed to be before the cosmic parasite had arrived. You see now. The two fingers spoke without moving its lips, its voice resonating through the crystallized souls beneath my feet. You see what we have become, what we were forced to become. The silver fragment in my palm grew so hot I could smell my flesh burning, but I didn't dare let go. It was the only thing protecting me from being absorbed into the floor like all the others, the only anchor I had to my own individual consciousness in this place, where souls were reduced to raw material. We were guardians once, the two fingers continued, and now I could see memories flowing through the silver veins like luminous blood. We protected the boundary between life and death, ensuring that souls could pass safely from one state to another. But the greater will had offered us power, purpose, a chance to impose order on the chaos of natural cycles. I watched the memories play out in the silver light, cosmic beings of immense wisdom and power, serving as psychopomps for entire civilizations, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed consciousness to exist without becoming trapped in eternal loops of suffering. They had been beautiful once, terrible in their alien majesty, but ultimately benevolent in their cosmic function. We thought we were accepting partnership, the two fingers said, and its voice carried centuries of regret. We believed the greater will when it promised that death could be made kinder, more purposeful. We didn't understand that it saw consciousness itself as a resource to be harvested. The chamber began to fill with golden light, not the warm, comforting radiance I had once associated with divine blessing, but something hungry and acquisitive, reaching toward me with tendrils that felt more like grasping tentacles than illumination. I could feel it trying to burrow into my mind, offering me visions of eternal peace and purpose, if I would just surrender my individual will to the greater design. But the silver fragment burned against my palm, and through its protective fire, I saw what that eternal peace really looked like. I was shown the true fate of every soul that had ever been claimed by the greater will's system. They weren't destroyed or transformed, they were edited, stripped of everything that made them individuals, reduced to pure experiential data that could be recombined and repurposed according to cosmic needs. The walking dead in Summonwater Village weren't animated corpses. They were biological computers, running programs built from the memories and personalities of people who had once been human. Every prayer I had ever spoken over a grave had been a lie. Every blessing I had bestowed upon the dead had actually been a binding spell, marking them for collection by forces that saw human consciousness as nothing more than a particularly interesting form of currency. "But you can change this," the two fingers said, and the silver infection spread further through its massive form. "The fragment you carry is more than just protection. It's a seed, a remnant of what death was meant to be before the corruption took hold. Plant it in the right soil, and it will grow into something that can break the cycles that bind us all." I looked down at the crystallized souls beneath my feet, seeing faces I recognized among the countless trapped forms. My parents were there, and their parents before them, stretching back through generations of my family line. All of them conscious, all of them aware, all of them screaming silently as their essence was slowly processed into component parts for the greater will's incomprehensible projects. "What soil?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer and recoiled from its implications. "Your own death," the two fingers replied, with something that might have been compassion. "The fragment can only grow in the moment of transition between life and whatever comes after. You must die truly, completely, without the golden grace to catch your soul and bind it to service. Only then can you plant the seed of natural death in a place where it can take root and spread." The golden light intensified, and I could feel the greater will's attention focusing on our conversation with the weight of a cosmic eye. It had allowed me to descend this far, to learn these truths, because it was confident that knowledge alone couldn't threaten its system. But now it was beginning to understand that I carried something more dangerous than mere information. The crystallized souls beneath my feet began to pulse with renewed energy, and I could hear individual voices separating from the eternal choir, my mother calling my name, old friends begging for release, strangers pleading with me to end their suffering. The weight of their collective anguish pressed down on me like a physical force, and I understood that this was what I would be condemning myself to if I failed in whatever task lay ahead. But I also understood that this was what I would be condemning everyone else to if I succeeded only in saving myself. "How do I die truly?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. The two fingers smiled, and the expression was more terrible than any scream. "You must find a place where the golden grace cannot reach, where the natural laws still hold sway over the transition between life and death. Such places exist, but they are guarded by things far worse than the greater will's servants. Ancient powers that remember the time before order, chaotic forces that would rather see all consciousness dissolved into primordial void than allow it to be systematically harvested." As if summoned by those words, something stirred in the darkness beyond the chamber's edges. I felt the attention of entities that made the greater will seem almost benevolent by comparison, things that had existed since the birth of the universe and viewed the emergence of consciousness as a cosmic mistake to be corrected. The silver infection in the two fingers suddenly accelerated, spreading through its entire form in seconds. The massive being began to crack and crumble, but instead of revealing stone underneath, the breaks exposed pure silver light that sang with the voices of every soul it had helped to shepherd across the boundary between life and death in eons past. "Go," the two fingers said as its form began to collapse. "Find the place where three paths meet in darkness. Plant the seed in soil watered by tears that have never known hope. And remember, True death is not an ending. It is the beginning of something the greater will can never touch or corrupt or claim. The chamber exploded into golden fire as the greater will's attention focused fully on this act of rebellion. I felt cosmic forces beyond my comprehension colliding around me, reality itself beginning to bend and warp under the pressure of their conflict. The crystallized souls beneath my feet began to crack and sing, their voices rising in a crescendo that threatened to shatter my sanity. I ran, clutching the burning silver fragment to my chest, feeling pieces of my own soul being torn away by the gravitational pull of competing cosmic forces. Behind me, I could hear the two fingers' final words echoing through dimensions I couldn't perceive. The brutal reality of death in Elden Ring is that it was never meant to be brutal at all. We made it so. But you can unmake what we have done. The chamber collapsed into itself as I reached the stairs, reality folding like paper behind me. I climbed toward the surface, carrying the weight of ultimate truth and the burden of impossible choice. I knew now what I had to do, and I knew that doing it would cost me everything I had ever been or hoped to become. But I also knew that not doing it would cost everyone else their chance at true peace, forever. The brutal reality of death in Elden Ring was about to demand its final price, and I was the only one who could pay it. I emerged from the collapsing crypt into a world that had fundamentally changed, or perhaps I was the one who had changed, and could now see what had always been there. The fog that shrouded Summonwater Village was no longer just mist, but crystallized screams given form, each droplet containing the essence of someone who had died in agony and been denied the release of true death. The walking dead still moved through their eternal motions, but now I could see the silver threads that connected them to something beyond the greater will's reach, fragments of their original selves that had somehow escaped the golden harvest. The silver fragment in my palm had grown cold during my ascent, but it pulsed with a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. With each pulse, I could feel knowledge flowing through me, not the overwhelming flood of cosmic truth I had experienced below, but precise, practical understanding of what needed to be done. The two fingers had been right about the location. There was indeed a place where three paths met in darkness, a convergence point where the natural laws still held dominion over death. But getting there would require passing through territories that made the horrors I had already witnessed seem like gentle dreams. I began my journey north, following instincts that weren't entirely my own. The silver fragment was guiding me, but it was also changing me, and I could feel my perception of reality shifting with each step. Colors became more vivid and terrible, revealing the golden corruption that infected every living thing. Sounds carried harmonics that spoke of cosmic suffering on scales too vast for human comprehension. Even the air itself seemed thick with the residue of harvested souls, making each breath a communion with the dead. The first sign that I was approaching something significant came when the golden threads that connected all life in the lands between began to converge. I could see them now as clearly as I could see the road beneath my feet, streams of luminous energy flowing from every plant, every animal, every stone toward a distant point that blazed like a second sun on the horizon. This was the heart of the greater will's power in the material world, the nexus through which it exercised control over the cycle of life and death. But there were other threads too, darker ones that ran in different directions entirely. These were silver-black, like tarnished metal, and they carried energies that made my soul recoil in instinctive terror. They led toward places where the greater will's influence had never taken hold, primordial spaces that remembered the universe as it had existed before consciousness emerged to complicate the simple dance between creation and destruction. As I followed these darker threads, the landscape around me began to change in ways that hurt to perceive directly. Trees grew downward into the sky, their roots drinking starlight while their branches burrowed deep into the earth. Rivers flowed uphill, carrying water that reflected images of places that had never existed. The very ground beneath my feet felt uncertain, as if reality here was more a matter of consensus than physics. I was entering the domain of the frenzied flame, the antithesis to the greater will's ordered harvest of consciousness. Where the greater will sought to preserve and systematize every soul, the frenzied flame wished to burn away the very concept of individual existence, returning all consciousness to the primordial chaos from which it had first emerged. The change in my own body began subtly. My fingertips started to tingle, then burn, as yellow flames began to dance beneath my skin. Not the golden radiance of the greater will, but something wilder and more destructive. Fire that consumed not flesh, but the very idea of identity itself. I could feel my memories beginning to blur at the edges, my sense of self becoming fluid and uncertain. But the silver fragment fought against this dissolution, anchoring me to my purpose, even as the frenzied flame tried to unmake everything I was. The two forces warred within me, order and chaos, preservation and destruction, the desire to save souls and the urge to free them through annihilation. I was becoming a battleground for cosmic principles that had been in conflict since the dawn of existence. The place where three paths met in darkness revealed itself gradually, more a sensation than a destination. I found myself standing at the center of a vast crater where the earth had been burned away by forces too intense for matter to withstand. 3 roads led into this desolation from different directions, one paved with golden light, one made of silver shadow, and one that seemed to be constructed from crystallized screams. At the crater's heart grew a single tree, but it was unlike anything that should have been able to exist. Its trunk was black as void. Its branches reached both up toward the stars and down into the earth's depths, and its leaves were made of pure flame that burned without consuming itself. This was the Erd tree's antithesis, the shadow twin that had been growing in secret, while the greater will's golden order dominated the surface world. Beneath the tree, the soil was exactly as the 2 fingers had described. Dark earth watered by tears that had never known hope, fertilized by the remains of everyone who had ever chosen true death over golden immortality. This was where I would have to plant the silver fragment, and where I would have to die in the truest sense of the word. But I was not alone in this place. 3 figures waited beneath the shadow tree, each representing one of the paths that led to this convergence. The first was robed in golden light, beautiful and terrible, speaking for the greater will's promise of eternal order. The second was wreathed in yellow flame, its form constantly shifting between human and something far more primal, advocating for the complete dissolution of consciousness into chaotic unity. The third was neither light nor flame, but an absence so complete it seemed to draw reality into itself, the representative of true death, natural ending, the state that existed before the cosmic forces had arrived to complicate the simple cycle of existence and void. Matthias of Limgrave, they spoke in unison, their voices creating harmonies that made the air itself vibrate with cosmic tension. You have carried our gifts to this place of convergence. Now you must choose which path to follow into whatever comes next. The golden figure stepped forward, and I could see within its radiance the faces of everyone I had ever known and loved, all preserved in perfect detail, all promising eternal reunion, if I would only accept the greater will's embrace. Your suffering can end, it said. Every soul you seek to save can find peace within our design. Individual pain dissolved into collective purpose, loneliness transformed into unity, death made meaningful through service to something greater than mortal understanding. The flame-wreathed figure countered with visions of complete freedom, the ecstatic dissolution of all boundaries, the return to a state where suffering was impossible because the very concept of individual experience would cease to exist. Why preserve the cage of self when you could be everything and nothing, it asked. Let all consciousness burn away, and in that burning find the peace that comes with perfect unity. But it was the third figure that spoke to something deeper in my soul, something that remembered what I had been before cosmic forces had turned me into their unwilling instrument. You were a gravedigger, it said simply. You understood that death was not an enemy to be conquered or a state to be transcended, but a natural part of existence. The soil remembers what you have forgotten, that endings can be gentle, that rest can be complete, that some things are not meant to last forever. I looked at the silver fragment in my palm, feeling its weight not just as a physical object, but as the accumulated hopes of every soul trapped in the greater will's golden web. They were all counting on me to make the right choice, but what was right in a situation where every option led to unimaginable consequences? If I chose the greater will's path, I would preserve consciousness at the cost of freedom, ensuring that every soul could exist forever but never truly live. If I chose the frenzied flame, I would grant perfect freedom at the cost of existence itself, liberating everyone by destroying the very possibility of individual experience. But if I chose true death, if I plant this fragment, I asked the third figure, what happens to everyone who has already been caught in the golden harvest? What about the souls crystallized beneath Summonwater Village, the walking dead, the people transformed into living statues? They will be given a choice, the figure replied. For the first time since the Greater Will's arrival, they will be able to decide their own fate. Some will choose to continue existing within the golden system, preferring known suffering to unknown release. Some will embrace the flame and dissolution. But others, many others, will finally be able to rest. I knelt beside the shadow tree and pressed the silver fragment against the dark soil. The moment it touched the earth, I felt the cosmic forces that had been warring within me reach a kind of equilibrium. The golden light, the yellow flame, and the silver darkness merged into something new. Not the domination of one principle over another, but a genuine choice between different forms of existence and non-existence. But the fragment would only grow if it was watered with the death of someone who truly understood what death meant, someone who chose ending not as escape, but as completion. I had to die here, beneath this impossible tree, with full knowledge of what I was giving up and what I was making possible for others. The transformation had already begun. I could feel my body changing, not into something golden or flame-wrapped, but into a bridge between states of being. My flesh was becoming translucent, revealing the silver light that now flowed through my veins like luminous blood. My consciousness was expanding beyond the boundaries of individual selfhood, while somehow remaining essentially me. This was transcendence without conquest, transformation without loss of identity. I was becoming something that could exist simultaneously in life and death, serving as a guardian of the choice I was about to make possible for others. The brutal reality of death in Elden Ring, I whispered to the three cosmic forces, is that it was never supposed to be brutal. Death should be a doorway, not a prison, an ending that makes new beginnings possible. I lay down beneath the shadow tree and closed my eyes, feeling the silver fragment sink into the soil beneath me. The last thing I saw before true darkness claimed me was a single silver sprout pushing through the earth, growing toward a light that was neither golden nor flame, but something entirely its own. The light of genuine choice, of authentic ending, of death as it was meant to be. The cosmic forces fell silent as I crossed the threshold, and for the first time in my existence, I knew what true peace felt like. But my story was not over. In dying truly, I had planted something that would grow beyond death itself, offering every trapped soul in the lands between a chance to choose their own fate. The brutal reality was becoming something beautiful at last. I awakened to the sound of silence, not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. The first sensation was coolness against my face, like morning dew on grass. But when I opened my eyes, I realized I was lying not on earth, but on something that resembled crystallized starlight. The shadow tree still stood above me, but it had changed fundamentally. Where once its branches had reached in impossible directions, now they formed a perfect canopy that seemed to contain entire universes within its leaves. I was dead. I knew this with absolute certainty, felt it in the stillness of my chest where no heart beat, in the way my breath came not from necessity but from choice. Yet I was also more alive than I had ever been, existing in a state that transcended the simple binary of life and death that had once defined my understanding of existence. The silver fragment had grown into something magnificent. Where I had planted it in the dark soil, a garden now flourished, not of flowers or trees but of possibilities. Each plant that grew there represented a choice, a different path that souls could take when faced with the decision of how to meet their ending. Some glowed with gentle golden light, offering continued existence within refined versions of the Greater Will's design. Others flickered with contained flame, promising dissolution into unified consciousness. But most were silver, representing the path of true death, complete, natural, and final. As I stood and examined my transformed body, I understood what I had become. Neither fully alive nor traditionally dead, I was something new, a keeper of choices, a guardian of the threshold between existence and whatever lay beyond. My flesh had become translucent, revealing the silver light that flowed through me like luminous blood. When I moved, I left brief after-images that showed glimpses of every person whose death I had ever tended, every soul I had helped to find rest in my years as a gravedigger. The cosmic forces that had warred over this place were gone, but their influence remained woven into the fabric of reality here. This crater had become a sanctuary, a place where the natural laws of death could operate without interference from entities that sought to harvest or destroy consciousness for their own incomprehensible purposes. But the real test of what I had accomplished lay beyond this protected space, in the wider lands between where millions of souls remained trapped in their golden prison. I began to walk, and with each step I felt the network of silver light that now connected me to every trapped soul throughout the realm. They were waking up, not to life, but to awareness of choice. For the first time since the Greater Will's arrival, they could decide their own fate. My first destination was Summonwater Village, where the walking dead still performed their eternal pantomime of life. But as I approached through the luminescent fog, I could see that things had changed. The figures moving through their mechanical routines were pausing, looking around with genuine confusion and dawning recognition. The golden light that had driven them was still present, but it no longer compelled obedience. It had become one option among many. I found the woman who had been the village herbalist in life, an elderly figure I recognized from my vision in the crypt below. She stood motionless beside what had once been her cottage, staring at her translucent hands with an expression of wonder and terror. "What's happening to me?" she asked as I approached. Her voice carried none of the hollow echo I had heard from the walking dead before. This was genuinely her, the essential person she had been in life, freed from the cosmic programming that had been controlling her actions. "You have a choice to make," I told her, and as I spoke, the silver light within me created visible representations of her options. She could see the golden path that would return her to the Greater Will's system, but with awareness and genuine consent this time. She could see the flame that would dissolve her individual consciousness into something larger and more primal, and she could see the silver path that would grant her true death, complete, final, and natural. "I've been walking in circles for so long," she whispered, tears that glowed with silver light streaming down her cheeks, "grinding herbs that don't exist, tending patients who are already dead, speaking words I don't remember choosing. How long has it been?" 73 years since your body died," I replied gently. "But that time is over now. You can choose what happens next." She studied the 3 paths I had made visible, her expression cycling through fear, hope, and something that might have been relief. Finally, she reached toward the silver light, and the moment her fingers touched it, she began to fade, not disappearing, but becoming complete in a way that transcended physical presence. "Thank you," she said, as she crossed the threshold into true death. "Thank you for letting me rest." This scene repeated itself throughout Summonwater Village as the trapped souls awakened to their newfound freedom of choice. Some chose to remain in the golden system, preferring the familiar suffering to the unknown territory of genuine ending. A few embraced the flame, allowing their individual consciousness to dissolve into something larger than themselves. But most, like the herbalist, chose the silver path, true death, complete and natural. As each soul made their choice and departed, the village began to change. Buildings that had been sustained by the trapped spiritual energy started to crumble back into the earth. The lake of red gold liquid began to clear, revealing normal water underneath. The fog lifted, allowing sunlight to reach the ground for the first time in decades. From Summonwater Village, I traveled to the Bridge of Sorrows, where the transformed figures still stood in their golden prisons. Here the choice was more complex. These people had been changed so fundamentally that returning to normal life was impossible, but they could still decide how to proceed with their altered existence. The woman in traveling robes, who had silently pleaded for help, chose to remain as she was, but freed from the compulsion to serve the Greater Will. She would become a guardian of the bridge, helping other travelers understand the nature of death in the lands between. A merchant chose the flame, saying he was tired of individual existence and wanted to merge with something greater. A warrior chose true death, expressing gratitude for the battles he had fought, but acknowledging that he was ready for his war to end. With each choice made freely, the bridge itself began to heal. The red-gold liquid in the river below cleared to normal water, and new grass began to grow along the banks. The oppressive atmosphere of despair lifted, replaced by something that felt more like a memorial than a prison. But the most significant change came when I returned to my own cemetery in Limgrave. The voices that had once whispered desperately from beneath the earth were now singing, not the forced harmony of the cosmic choir, but individual songs of gratitude and farewell. Each grave was surrounded by silver light, as the souls buried there made their choices about how to proceed. My father chose true death, telling me through the silver connection that he was proud of what I had accomplished and ready to rest. My mother chose to remain connected to the golden system, but with full awareness and consent, saying she wanted to continue existing in some form to watch over the village. Old friends made their own decisions based on their own desires and understanding of what they wanted from existence. The cemetery transformed as these choices were made. Graves that held souls who chose true death began to settle naturally, their occupants finally at peace. Those that contained souls who chose to remain in the golden system became small shrines, places where the living could come to commune with the dead without the conversation being mediated by cosmic forces with their own agendas. As the weeks passed, news of what had happened spread throughout the lands between. Travelers brought stories of similar awakenings in distant lands, crypts where ancient nobles were finally allowed to choose their fate, battlefields where fallen warriors could decide whether to continue their eternal conflicts or lay down their arms forever, libraries where scholar spirits could choose between continuing their research and finding the rest they had been denied. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Some worshipped the greater will so completely that they saw the new freedom of choice as a form of cosmic rebellion that threatened the natural order. Others had become so dependent on the promise of golden immortality that they couldn't conceive of existence without it. A few powerful entities that had built their authority on controlling the dead fought desperately to maintain their systems of spiritual slavery. But the silver light had been planted in soil, watered by tears that had never known hope, and it grew stronger with each soul that chose its own path. The network of choice spread like roots through the spiritual substrate of the lands between, creating new possibilities wherever it took hold. I found my new role as keeper of choices, both fulfilling and heartbreaking. Every day brought souls who had been trapped for decades or centuries, suddenly aware that they could decide their own fate. Some choices were easy: elderly spirits ready for rest, young souls eager to explore what lay beyond death, warriors who had found peace and wanted to lay down their burdens. Others were agonizingly difficult: parents separated from children by death, lovers torn apart by the golden harvest, scholars who had spent lifetimes accumulating knowledge they couldn't bear to lose. But in every case, the choice was genuinely theirs to make. Months later, as I stood in my transformed cemetery watching the sunrise paint the world in colors that were no longer tainted by golden corruption, I realized that death in the lands between had finally returned to what it was meant to be, a natural transition that each soul could navigate according to their own understanding and desire. The brutal reality of death in Elden Ring had been that it wasn't death at all, but a form of cosmic imprisonment dressed up as divine blessing. True death, the kind that allowed for genuine rest, authentic ending, and the possibility of whatever came after individual consciousness, had been corrupted into a harvesting system that served entities whose priorities bore no resemblance to human values. Now death was simply death again, final for those who chose finality, transformative for those who sought change, continuing for those who weren't ready to let go. The choice belonged to each soul, not to cosmic forces that viewed consciousness as a resource to be managed. I would continue my work as a gravedigger, but in a new capacity. Instead of preparing bodies for a golden harvest they couldn't escape, I helped souls understand their options and supported them in making choices that reflected their own desires rather than cosmic imperatives they had never agreed to serve. The silver light within me pulsed with each sunrise and sunset, connecting me to every soul in the lands between who faced the mystery of their own ending. I was no longer just Matthias the gravedigger, but something more, a guardian of authentic choice in a world that had forgotten what freedom looked like. And in that role, surrounded by the gentle sounds of souls choosing their own paths forward, I found a peace deeper than any I had known in life. The brutal reality of death had been transformed into something beautiful, the simple, profound gift of being able to choose one's own ending. The dead could rest at last, and in their rest, I had found my purpose.